What are a couple of things we talked about in the Ten Commandments that stand out in your mind that we talked about a little differently? Let's see if anybody remembers any of these things. Everybody check your phone because the pastor's phone just went off. Phyllis grabbed her so quick. She said, I don't want to be the one. I don't want to be the one. Okay, so the Ten Commandments, a couple of things that maybe stood out in your mind. We kind of went over a couple of things pretty hard, and pretty in depth just to kind of make big deals about them. So we'll see if you remembered any of it.
These are not suggestions.
They're not suggestions, they're commandments. That's true. They're not suggestions, they're commandments. That's one. That wasn't what we said, but it's true. Any particular things? Nobody remembers. I'm glad y'all listen when I talk. It's good. You just old and forget it? Buddy said that. I didn't, okay, by the way. Buddy said it's not that we don't listen. We just old and we forget. So, but, okay, so there's a couple of things let's point out. Let's go back to the beginning. If number one is not true, then the other 9 are not real. That's good. If you can't get a hold of number one and make number one exactly true 100%, then the rest of them don't matter. Because if you have any other gods before you, then, well, the rest of God's commandments don't really mean anything, right? So it's a very true statement. All right? Something else. Anybody else? I did mine. Sharon's happy. She got hers in. There was one last week that I really enjoyed that I don't think everybody kind of maybe got as big a kick out of as I did, but I love that thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. All right, is that how it said it? Let's read that one again. Make sure I get that just right. Back up in verse number 16. You shall not bear false witness against you. Oh, I did say it right. Okay, against your neighbor. So as long as I'm not lying about my neighbor, I can lie. Well, it just said, thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. I did explain it. That's right. She's looking around going, he explained that. How did we get there? Indeed, we did. We talked about this in detail. The only ones sitting in here today that don't have excuse for not doing it are Phyllis and Dawn, because they weren't here last week, and maybe Dr. Masters, but he'll have an opinion on it in a minute, I guarantee. But think about that. Isn't that what it says? Explicitly, thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. Right? It just says it out loud. So as long as I'm not lying against my neighbor, I can lie? Okay, we went a long way around the bush to get here, but we got there when we said every lie that we tell is effective to our neighbors, whether it's in testimony or in some kind of direct effect or whatever. So that bearing false witness against neighbor it encompasses everything. We went kind of a long way to get there, but we got there. So it encompasses all things. So falsehood is not okay in any way, shape, or form. One of the other things that we pointed out really important was that when he talks about not making any graven images, we'll find this out later on, and we'll expound on it even more later on, but one of the problems that the children of Israel had coming out of a heathen, pagan nation, Egypt, was that the main form of worship was to erect some sort of image of what you were worshiping, right? So they would build and erect these massive idols and images and so on and so forth, and they would make these things and they would worship them. God's dictate never was, thou shalt not make graven images and worship other gods. God's dictate was, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven images, period. And one of the very first things that the children of Israel are going to do when we get down the road here just a little bit is we're going to find out that the very first thing they do, they attack Aaron when Moses is up on the mountain too long. He's up there for about 40 days, and they say, hey, something's happened, it's gone. Make us an image so that we may worship God. They don't say so we can worship the gods of Egypt. They don't say so we can. So what happens is they go right away into back into getting into the first couple of commandments here that God says, first you have to obey me, but then you can't have any other gods before me, of course. But then he says, you can't have any graven images. You can't worship those things, whether they represent me or they represent anyone else. Now, that's important because of something we're going to talk about when we get down to the end of this chapter. We're going to relate this back to here a little bit. But I think that's one of the biggest things that we have to put out there, because that particular commandment really is in complete opposition to Roman Catholicism. Statues and monuments and all of these things that they use and they literally pray to, which is a form of worship. When you pray to a statue, when you pray to a crucifix, when you pray to, well, we can get into the thing where they pray to other people outside of Jesus and God anyway, but that's a whole different lesson. So we see these images, though. Rosary beads, an image, right? Something that is used in worship outside of just worshiping God. There's an intent, an implied intent in the worship in Pentecostalism and in Christianity, kind of on a whole, really. But especially in Pentecostalism, where there's an implied intent of worship that does not ever allow for there to be a physical object of that worship, or a physical go-between in worship, so to speak, right? To have a physical object to be the sign of my worship. The most we end up doing is hanging a cross in our buildings or something, just as remembrance of the sacrifice of Christ, but not to be worshipped. We don't have the cross there as a focus of worship. It is a focus of remembering, but we never use it as either a focus point of worship or a channel or vessel through which we contact God, which is, by the way, one of the main kind of teachings, I'll say it out loud, teachings of Roman Catholicism, is you're going through so many different avenues to get to God. So it's very, very, it's heretical in its teaching. Yeah.
One of the big differences is the difference of the Protestant cross and the Eastern Orthodox and the Western Orthodox of Roman Catholicism and their crucifix. Hence, with no icon, thou shalt have no other icon, replica of a deity before you, and just having the symbol is much, much different.
Yeah, this comment is the difference between having the Protestant cross, which is an empty cross of remembrance of the action and sacrifice of Jesus, as opposed to a Eastern or Western Orthodox Catholicism of a crucifix, which is a Jesus hanging on a cross, which is still worshiping an image. Once again, it's not just it's not just making an image and worshiping an image. Okay? He says, thou shalt not make any graven images. Whether you're going to worship Ra, the sun god of Egypt, or you're going to worship Yahweh, Jehovah, the God of Israel, you still don't make a graven image to do so. Period. Now, of course, worshiping a god of Egypt is obviously much worse. Obviously, okay? But even in the worship to the God of Israel, the Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he still says, thou shalt not make any graven images of worship. Period. And one of the very first things that is going to bring the wrath of God that Israel is going to do is they are going to revert back to the make me an image so I may worship God problem when they have Aaron make this golden calf. God is not angered that they want to worship him. God is angered that they've already forgotten, don't make any graven images. They're dancing and worshiping to some golden calf instead of coming directly before God. Okay, and I kind of using that. We haven't gotten there yet in the reading, but I'm using that because I want to make this point. I want us to see what this commandment means. This commandment doesn't mean thou shalt worship no other gods, because he already states that ahead of that when he said thou shalt have no other gods before me in verse number 2. He's already stated don't have any other gods before me. So when he comes to verse 3, or excuse me, that's verse number 3. When he comes to verse number 4, you shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness or anything that is in heaven and earth above and the sea below and all that stuff, right? He begins to talk about that because he's saying you don't need images, you don't need things, you don't need tangible stuff to worship. You need to worship me in how? Spirit and in truth. That's where we have to come before God. So it's an important lesson for us to see. Don't worship anything. Anything. Even if you want to call it, well, that's my avenue to worship God. I need to hold my rosary beads in my hand so I have my contact with God. As long as I can rub those rosary beads around in my hand and I can keep saying the words over and over and over again, then I got my contact with God. It is absolutely in error and in conflict with the second commandment of God. Okay? So I want to point this out very vividly. You may not always remember everything, but there's a couple of these things I want you to remember out loud. I want somebody to be able to ask you the question about the Ten Commandments and what really stands out to you. And I want you to see some of these things because these are the things that absolutely are in conflict with teachings of organized religion that would state we're going to have these little things. You know, there's no sin in a bumper sticker unless the bumper sticker is what you're worshiping. There's no sin in wearing a cross around your neck unless you're worshiping those things. Now, I think there's much more error in wearing a crucifix than wearing a cross because I think it still symbolizes that worshiping an idol issue, and it also symbolizes one of the things we don't like about it in Protestantism is that it has Christ still on a cross, which he is not. Okay, so we teach against that just because of that particular thing. But I think the deeper problem with it is that it becomes a graven image, an idol, if you will. Okay? So we have to be very careful with how we deal with these things. Yes?
Can you explain what does graven mean?
Carved. A graven image is a carved or a sculpted image of some kind. You know, when you take wood and you carve wood, or you take metals and you sculpt them, or clay or limestone, or you know, some kind of ore that you're sculpting into something, or even pouring in, you know, gold, like the golden calf that Aaron would have made. See, he wouldn't have gone out and made some huge mold and poured in gold and made this calf. What he would have done is he would have built this calf out of wood, and then he would have layered gold over it to fashion it. That's the way that those things would be made. They would make thin sheets of gold and lay them over it and fashion into this beautiful thing. So what happens is that there's these carved, molded images that get made, and people tend to worship through an image. Why do you think it's so important that God says don't do that? Even if you're going to worship me, don't do it. Well, but if you know, and I'm going to play devil's advocate with you a little bit. No pun intended. But let me play devil's advocate with that. Now, if I'm worshiping Christ, if I've got my crucifix and I'm praying to Christ and I'm worshiping through that crucifix, I'm still acknowledging to honor God in that process. Why is that not okay? Besides the fact he says thou shalt not, okay? Let's just take that out of the way. He's already said thou shalt. Let's take that part out of the way. Why do you think it's so important, though, that thou shalt not? Outside of the direct commandment.
Isn't it like they do in catechism where they pray through a priest to talk to God? So like if you're talking to an image, then you feel that you have to go through this image to go to God rather than just go to God?
Well, we've established that it's going through an image to God, and that God is not ordained that. But why do you think God does not want us going through images or people for that matter of fact. We're in the dispensation of grace, not the dispensation of law, where there is a priesthood that we have to go through to get to God anymore, right? So that's why he came and died, to take away that need for the priest, for the mediator. He became the mediator. We no longer need the other mediator, okay? So why do you think it's so important that right here in the beginning of law, these are the beginnings of law, right? These are the very first laws that God's really laying down to his people. Why is it so important to say this right here? What's that? Relationship. So in relationship, personal relationship, so there's one word that comes into this play. If I'm truly going to have relationship with God, I can't have it with an image. I've got to have it with God directly. But there's something that we have a habit of doing as humans, is that if we can make a tangible idol of some kind as a point of contact with God, we can feel better about stuff. We have our little points of contact, right? And you know what? In every Catholic incident that I know of, these are points of contact with God. People value them very highly because they're their literal point of contact with God. When God says there's no need for that because now we have personal relationship. There's absolutely no need for any of this. In fact, I've told you don't do it. I said don't do it. Why? Because when I have a point of contact with the tangible, my faith becomes in that tangible. Buddy said I knew it all along. So if my faith is in the tangible, then my faith is not truly Hebrews faith. What does Hebrews 11:1 tell us about faith? What does Hebrews 11:1 tell us about faith? You got Bibles in front of you. You can just pull it up and read it if you don't remember it. Can anybody quote that? Okay, so now faith is the substance of what? It's a substance of what? Things hoped for. It is the evidence of that which is not seen. So substance and evidence. Substance, tangible. Evidence, proof. So faith is the tangible proof of God. Not my idol. Not my rosary beads. Not my crucifix. Not even my Star of David hanging on the wall, or anything that you might use as a point of contact to God. Yeah, it's all right to have a cross hanging on the wall. It's all right to have a Star of David hanging. That's not my point. But I'm telling you right now, those are not your faith points. If they are, your faith is in a graven image. Your faith is your tangible proof of God. So it takes the need away. So in Exodus 20, way back in the beginning of law, God says, stop needing something to go to see me through. I'm going to give you faith, and your faith will be your tangible proof, your substance and evidence. Period. You don't need a crucifix. You don't need rosary beads. You don't need a statue of Jesus or Mary for sure, or any other saint. You certainly don't need all that. You don't need some statue of God. And in fact, we're going to get down into this. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about altars. We're going to talk a little more deeply about some of this stuff, about the way we do stuff. So that's why I want to establish this up front. I want to bring this back to our remembrance so we don't forget faith. That's your tangible proof. That is your substance and evidence. Okay? That's where you need to start from. That's where you need to grow from. And that's where you need to abide and remain. Period. Not with all the other junk. That's where we abide and remain. Okay? So now let's go down to verse number 18. Verse 18. Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet. Excuse me. and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. Then they said to Moses, you speak with us, and we will hear. But let not God speak to us, lest we die. And Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, and that his fear may be before you, so that you may not sin. So the people stood afar off, but Moses drew near the thick darkness where God was. So Moses is having these conversations with God. He's with the people, and they see what's going on in this mountain, and they say, look, we'll talk to you, but don't get any of that near us. We don't want to get up there with God. You go. Now, I think this is pretty indicative of normal congregations, okay? So you go deal with all that stuff with God. Just you come back and talk to us, but we don't want to get in the middle of all that, okay? If there's going to be thundering and lightning and there's going to be lightning strikes, we'll send the pastor off to deal with that. You just come back and tell us what God said. All right? You got my back, right? But as long as it's a far back. But see, that's the point. There is, now Moses is obviously chosen, okay? I don't want to take that lightly. I don't want to diminish the importance of the choosing of the man of God. All right? I don't want to diminish that at all, okay? But I do want us to understand something about our human nature. Our human nature is let somebody else go take all of the heat. Let somebody else go deal with all the tough stuff, and let me just be the beneficiary of it. Think about that. Isn't that true? Because I'm the same way. For a lot of years when God was calling me to do things, but my dad was the pastor of the church, and I have used it. Some of you who are around then may have heard me tell you this. Hey, go ask him. It's his church. He's the boss. I did that dozens upon dozens of times with people because they'd come to me and ask me questions. Or even worse, they'd come to me with some kind of grievance because they weren't very happy about what was going on, thinking I could go talk to the pastor for them. Now, that's where they saw all the thunderings and lightnings coming out of the pastor's office, and they figured they'd send another emissary right over to do. And I would tell them, hey, you know what? That's his deal. You got to go talk to him. But there are times when God chooses us to do that process of dealing and talking directly to him and taking care of people and doing things. And human nature is we don't really want to be in that position because that's a tough position. You know, it's really cool to be chosen. That's an honor. It's a great honor, but it also carries a great weight that goes along with a lot of those things. And Moses had that weight upon his shoulders, but Moses had been trained to carry the weight. One of the things that happened to Moses when he was in Egypt is he was trained to carry the weight of royalty. He was trained to carry the weight of the people. He was trained to carry the weight of great responsibility. In all that process, Moses was trained for this. He was trained to lead. He was trained to rule, all those things. So in that training, that 40 years of training that Moses receives in the household of Pharaoh, it's awfully important. God uses all of that as a groundwork for what God's going to ask him to do. So in that process, Moses takes on that risk of being in direct contact with God. And Moses is happy to do it. He goes to, as the people command, and he goes in and he says, but God's going to say all of this to put the fear in you. Not so you can sit down and tremble at the feet of God, afraid of what he's going to do to you, but that reverent fear, right? The fear of the Lord is what? The beginning of wisdom. The reverencing the power of God is the beginning of your wisdom. When you fully come to the understanding of the awesomeness of God, the deity of God, all those things, that's where you start to become wise. That's the beginning of your wisdom. Okay? So this is exactly what Moses is saying here, hundreds of years before Solomon's going to write any of those words. He's saying that. He's telling us up front, this is where the beginning of your true relationship with God's going to come, because he's going to give you this stuff to place it in front of you so you can abide in that reverent fear of God and you do not have to get caught up in sin. You know what he told them? So the people, verse number 9, is it 19 or 20 here? 20. God and Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, and that his fear may be before you, so that you may not sin. If the people today would grab hold of verse 20, last year we needed a little 2020, right? Exodus 20:20. In 2020 would have been good for people to see God is before you, and he's placing himself before you so that you can be caught up in the fear of God again, and not the fear of man or the fear of sickness or the fear of any of those things, but the fear of God so that you don't sin. Oh, but we have to sin because we're human. It's a lie. You choose to sin in your humanity. You don't have to sin because you're human. You choose to sin in your humanity. Personal choice. We get wrapped up in it. We get caught up in it. And we excuse it. Well, that's not popular, especially today, but it's true. It's true. God laid it out from the beginning, and then he gave us the grace to overcome the sin in the new. The old covenant tells us that we have power to overcome sin. The new covenant tells us we have power to overcome sin. None of it says we're going to give you an excuse to sin. God's nature does not change. Let me tell you that right out loud. God states it many times throughout his word, but I'll tell you out loud, God's nature does not change. God's mind is not changed. He may change his approach to things sometimes. He might change the way he's going to do something to benefit someone, or because of the prayers of someone, the prayers of a righteous man, he might change a few things, but his mind and his nature don't change. His character doesn't change. So if God wanted us to have power to overcome sin in the beginning, you can guarantee God has given you power to overcome sin even in a greater way today, no matter how much it gets abused. And if the sin comes, remember this, that's your choice. That's the choice of man. To sin or not to sin, that is the question. Right? I mean, that's just the bottom line to it. That is such an unpopular statement, but it's the truth. You know why it's an unpopular statement? Because if we make the statement the other way, then it lets us off the hook for sin. If I make the statement the other way that, well, God knew that we couldn't abide the law, so he gave us grace, so no longer did we have to worry about the laws. That is not what is said, although it sounds a little bit like that when Paul's talking about it. God knew that the law was not perfect, in that the law needed to be fulfilled and completed through the Son, through the ultimate sacrifice, because man was not worthy or good enough to fulfill that law in and of himself. So the law became a perpetual sacrificing issue. Right? They just had to keep coming back and sacrificing because they kept messing that up and they couldn't deal with it on their own. But through the eternal sacrifice of Jesus Christ, now we find ourselves in the position of being the beneficiary of the grace of God to overcome that sin on an even greater level than anyone or any dispensation in history had ever had. That's our inheritance. That's what we've been adopted into. It's a beautiful thing. But it gets perverted and misused into a cheap grace, and the grace of God gets cheapened and lessened because men have decided, well, that grace came so that we don't have to worry about the sin issue anymore. We can get away with it because we prayed the prayer somewhere. So, in the middle of this, God's nature has not changed from the beginning through to Exodus, through to now. We were just talking about the dispensational teachings in dispensational theology earlier, and starting with that dispensation of innocence, the Adam and Eve, they were created in innocence. Then there was the dispensation of conscience after the fall of man that took us all the way from the fall of man to Noah's time, where there was a dispensation of conscience, where man kind of was ruled by his own conscience. And that didn't work out very well. said, Pastor, how could you say that? Because in the long run, Noah was the only one who could find grace in the eyes of the Lord, because Noah was the only one who had remained holy, had remained godly. That's pretty crazy, isn't it? Out of all the world. Now, the world didn't have billions of people in it at that particular time. The world was still being kind of populated and growing, but still, Noah was the only one. However many there might have been, if there would have been thousands or tens or hundreds of thousands or millions or tens of millions or hundreds, however many there might have been at that particular time, Noah was the only one. Even if he's the only one out of 1,000, that's horrible. That's just horrible. So it was an age of conscience, and that didn't work out so well, so the flood came. Then we had the age of government. The dispensation of the government that came in. Right? So we had all the way from the flood through the Tower of Babel and all the things that happened into there until we came into the age of the dispensation of promise, where God brought Abraham out and told Abraham, okay, I'm going to make promise. So now the children of Abraham were living under a dispensation of promise, where they were just living out through God's promise. That lasted for several hundred years until now we're here beginning. Right now you're seeing the beginning of the dispensation of law, where Moses will lay out the Mosaic and Levitical laws that will govern God's people. So in this dispensational process of God, God gets here and says, okay, this is the way we're going to do this. And I'm going to give you the answer. But the answer still is you can't revert to sin. Sin's not okay. And I'm going to put my fear, my reverent fear within you, not so you can think that once again, I'm that mean kid sitting on the anthill with a magnifying glass ready to zap you because you did something wrong, but so that you can see that it is wrong, so you can have an understanding of the right from wrong. You left that innocence in the garden. That innocence is gone. So now let's walk the road of law. No more sin. I'm going to give you the ways out of sin, but you have to still make the choice not to sin. Right? I'm going to set it out in front of you, and you can take it or leave it. If you take it, you're going to receive my blessing. If you leave it, well, and you disobey and you sin, then you're going to be required something very harsh. If you don't believe that, ask Achan. Right? God's laws were very harsh. All he did was took something he shouldn't have taken and hid it and lied. And what happened? He, not only just him, his whole family, his entire household, destroyed. Say, well, that was just in the dispensation of law. Then you talk to Ananias and Sapphira, who walked into the house of God and lied to God and God's men. What happened to them? They carried them out. And it wasn't because they were slain in the spirit. Well, kind of. A little more literal slaying. Right? So you don't believe in that slaying in the spirit? Read that Ananias and Sapphira story. That'll change your mind. So I just want to point this out really vividly, that the character and nature of God has not changed. Sin is sin. Sin is to be avoided. The choice for good instead of evil is to be made. We all have that knowledge. We know the difference. Make the right choice, okay? We have to stay under that. If we don't, we will fall prey to the judgments of God. Period. That's always been the design. He's given us a great methodology to stay away from the judgment. He's blessed us. This dispensation of grace is the most blessed dispensation of all. And without a doubt, we have it easier than anybody. But because of our ignorant nature, the human nature, we tend to take the blessings and we pervert them and we use them to just try to get away with stuff. And that's where we live in the society we live in today. It's the reason it looks like it does today. Okay? Let's move on, verse number 22. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, you have seen that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make anything to be with me, you shall not make anything to be with me, gods of silver or gods of gold, and you shall not make for yourselves." Now, he's talking once again about that graven image issue. He's talking once again about having no other gods before me. You can't have silver and gold, and you can't make it to me or outside of me either way. It's me and me alone. And you don't need an image to get to me. Now, if some of you would get real scholarly on me right now and real theological, you would say, but what about the Ark of the Covenant? If there has ever been a graven image to get to God, it's the Ark of the Covenant. And I would tell you, you know not of what you speak. I just thought I'd make the whole argument for you because I knew nobody was going to jump into that one. You know why? Because the Ark of the Covenant is not an image to worship God. It was just the seat for God. The Ark was not to be worshiped. It was to be revered because it was literally the mercy seat of God. It was the place whereon God would sit to judge. So it was to be revered, but it was not to be worshiped. Held in high esteem, but not worshiped. Big difference between worshiping something, or revering something. Right. And it's a direct replica of what exists in heaven. With the cherubim facing in and covering and all those things that are about it, it's a direct replica of what he sits. So it's not a symbol of God, but it is a symbol of the throne of God or the power of God to forgiveness. See, they would march this before them in battle, and they would do so many things, but it was not because they were worshiping the seat. They were doing as God had told them to. God told them to bring it before them in battle. God told them what to use it for. God told them where to place it in the tabernacle and then later in the temple. God directed it. Big difference than you and I deciding to erect or fashion something in a likeness so we can worship God or anything else, right? It's a big difference when God says do it, or I decide I'm going to make something to honor God. Let God direct you in the ways he wants to be honored and follow those, right? If you love me, keep my commandments. Don't go invent stuff. God doesn't need your help. And you know what's even further than that? You don't need your help in getting to God. That's where we trip up so often. We think we have to figure something out or figure some new way. God doesn't need you to do that. God's already given you all the tools that you need to get to him. It's already there. So whatever you go to create and whatever you go to invent, it becomes the gold and silver issue that God has challenged you and directed you without, he hasn't minced words here. He's very plain. He's very vivid about exactly what he's requiring of us. And he's telling us not to do. Right? Very clear. Crystal clear. Rabbi and I sing that song, I worship only at the feet of Jesus. One of the verses, one of the lines of the verses is, I bowed at altars of gold and silver, but as I knelt there, they turned to rust. Why? Because they're flawed. They're not holy. They're not pure. They're not deity. So why would I equate them to God? Why do we equate gold and silver to God? You ever stop to think about that? See, in our day and age, most of us just accept it because it's been done for millennia, right? People have done that for millennia. But why is it gold and silver and things like that? Precious, rare. Sometimes it's pure, sometimes it's not even pure, you know. Depends on how purified it may be. But we associate that rarity and that value that is placed on those things. We associate that because we take the very best of what we can and create it into God worship. Where God's never asked for that. You don't believe that? Hang on a second, I'll tell you. All right. Verse number 24. An altar of earth you shall make for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep, your oxen. In every place where I record my name, I will come to you, and I will bless you. And if you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stone, for if you use your tool on it, it shall be profane, or you shall have profaned it. Nor shall you go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness may not be exposed on it. So this takes us right to that next step of building those things and making those things. God says, I'm going to require of you to make altars. Now, God, we know that God requires altars. And when we get into the tabernacle, God's going to ask for some specific altars in specific ways. But that's going to be for a different issue. These are what God's saying. If you come in and you want to do something of your own, if you're going to come in and build me an altar, here's how you do it. You take rough, natural material and you just put it together. You don't use tools on it. You don't try to hew it into something, fashion it into something that is the way you think it should be. You take it from my creation and you lay it out and you place your offering upon it. Do it the way I said. Honor it the way I said. Now, how does he say this? In verse 24 again, he says, an altar of earth you shall make for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen in every place where I record my name. I will come to bless it. Verse 25 lays out the direction here. And if you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stone, for if you use your tool on it, you have profaned it. How can we, as the creation, form something out of our desire, our design, our imagination, whatever you want to use, even if it is born of desire to worship God? How can we, in our finite understanding of God, fashion something that would truly honor God? We won't. We can't. We can't understand it. We will profane it, he says. Right? Now, what does profaning it mean? Ruining? Even it's deeper than ruining. Corrupting is better. Corrupting it, polluting it, right? Why? Because it no longer is the truth of deity. It is man mixed with deity. It's my idea of deity. He says religion. It becomes religion. It becomes something that we put together to try to explain away God or to tell how things should be done to God. It becomes our crucifixes and our rosary beads and all those things. It becomes the stuff that we try to find to give us contact with God and to make it look good enough to be contact with God. Now, look, I am all for doing the very best we can for God, giving the best we have to God, all that stuff. I'm all for that. But there are limitations to what God has asked us for. Sometimes God asks us just to bring what he's told us to bring. And sometimes what he has asked us to bring is not always all that pretty. Present yourself a living sacrifice, right? I guarantee you, when you come as a living sacrifice, it's not all that pretty. Sorry if that offends you, but it's just true. It's just true. When we bring the wretch that we are and our filthy rags of righteousness before God, when we bring that, it ain't pretty, you know? It's not very attractive. And yet, he loves you so much, he can't wait to get it. He loves you so much, he's standing at the door knocking, almost begging for you to bring it. That's how much he loves you. That's how much he cares for you. All right? It's interesting because I think about this a lot of times. How many times do you ever hear anybody talk about their spouse and they're the most beautiful and they're this and that, and you look at them and you go, huh? It's true. It's absolutely true. As we age and as we grow, we grow old and we grow. There's all kinds of stuff that happens, right? Gravity takes over. Stuff happens, all right? Stuff's taking place. And true love looks at all that stuff and desires it more than the day when it was 18, 19, 20 years old and it looked the physical best it ever looked. Right? So you'll hear people talking, and I do it all the time. I talk about my wife all the time. Now, I love her. She don't look exactly the same as she did when she was winning beauty pageants. Children do things to you, both to your body and to your psyche. They do stuff to you, literally, right? Things are different. I couldn't, we couldn't go enter a Miss California teen pageant today. There's a lot of things we wouldn't qualify for in that. But today, I value and love her more and look at her no different than I did when she was 18 years old. And even more cherished than that time. Because at that time, it was very physical. It was very much the physical attraction. Today, it is a combination of physical and emotional and spiritual and all these things that make it so much more valuable, so much more intense of a feeling, And that's the same going, her looking at me, hopefully she looks at me, deeper today than she ever did. I never was real pretty, so she had to find something else about me that she liked up front, But all that stuff, and that's the way, it's my boyish charm. It's not that funny. What's the matter with you? It's you just hit him. He's slow, but he gets there. Oh, my Lord. But you know it's the truth, right? And we see these things, and God looks at us, and he looks so far beyond what men see, and he sees our heart, and he sees the potential. He sees what he made us for. He sees all that stuff. And he loves us in a way that we can't comprehend. But he says, look, you got to do it my way. Because my love transcends your transgression, but it will not transcend your will. He can look beyond my faults, but he will not go over my will. He will not take over my will. My will has to submit to his will. It's the price I must pay. It's the price I must pay. And that price says I got to do it his way. And if he says don't do, then I can't do. If he says go do, then I need to do. But I've got to follow his direction. And many, many times, it's painful. Many times I go, God, I'm not going to bring you some big old rock. I'm going to go over there and I'm going to get my tools out. I'm going to fashion it into something beautiful for you. And the whole time he said, I want the rock. Not looking for your interpretation of the rock. I'm looking for the rock. Bring me the stone. Build the altar. I'm not looking for what you want it to look like. I'm looking for what I called you to do. Right? Do you understand that? See that difference? And that paralyzes so many people's relationship with God because they're too busy bringing what they want to God instead of just asking God what he wants so I can just present that to him. Yes, he says, come just as you are. But he never said leave the same way. You don't leave different, then you haven't really met him. You haven't really experienced faith. You experienced religion, maybe. You experienced church, maybe. There's a big difference between experiencing religion and experiencing faith. Huge difference. So, one of the main things I really want us to get out of this today is the fact that we have to see what God calls and do it according to his will, not according to what looks better. Because, man, God, you just want me to throw some stones together and put some wood across the top of it and offer up the offering that way? At least let me make something that is worthy of God. How do you know what's worthy of God? You know what's worthy of God? What he says is. Because you're not worthy of God until he says you are. You're not worthy of the grace of God. None of us are. None of us are worthy of his grace except that he said we are. And without him saying you're worthy, you are not a candidate to receive. No man comes to him unless they be drawn. And we all have, and he says that he would that none would perish, so he tells us that he's going to draw everyone at some point, sometime. He's going to draw us, but you can't just come when you want, the way you want. You got to come when he draws you, the way he draws you. The way he brings you in. And when those moments come, you have to respond. You have the opportunity to respond. This is not just, I was one of those kids in church all the time that said, you know what, I'll just do what I want to, and right before I die, I'll just say, Lord, come into my heart. Now, all of you think I'm smart, and I just showed how ignorant I am, right? But I'm probably as ignorant as some other people sitting in this room. We just figured we'd handle it right before we died, and we'd take care of it. We could live our life and do what we want to. Well, number one, you never know if you're going to instantly drop dead, and you don't get the opportunity to, so that was kind of an ignorant plan, right, up front. But the second thing is, and what I learned later is that I don't get to come to him unless he's drawing me to come to him. So what's my job? My job is to respond to the call of God. Always, right? Pre-salvation and post-salvation, it's still, the job doesn't change. I need to respond to the call of God. I've got to respond to when and how he calls, not when and how I want. That in and of itself is awfully difficult.
You said about being, I'll just say, well, God, forgive me now. I did that for 50 years, but I knew better. It scared me to death.
Yeah, but he said he did it for 50 years, that I'll just come when I want to thing, but we know better. We know better. We know God needs to call us and woo us. He says we got to come through his calling. We got to come through the drawing of the Holy Spirit. It's all that. But it has to be pre and post salvation. Just because we accept him and get to salvation, we listen to the call pre-salvation and we answer it and we get saved. But post-salvation, after salvation, you got to keep answering the call. Got to keep doing it the way he says. Got to keep doing what he says. Doing it his way. That means what? Our will must be submitted to his will. We have to come in and do it his way. This altar thing is such a blazing sign to me that there is so much that we want to do our way because it's so much better for God. But God says, stop telling me what to do or how it should be done, and listen to me and let me tell you what I want. That's just it. And outside of that, we cannot find ourselves, as the apostle said, in the good, acceptable, or perfect will of God. There's levels to that will where we're acceptable and good and perfect in him, but we can't even get to the acceptable part if we're not willing to submit our will. If God says build an altar, build it the way he says to build it. We talked about old Jacob putting out his memorial stones. He didn't take them down to some granite guy and say, hey, I want you to fashion this beautiful... He took some stones. He took 12 stones and he stacked them as an altar, a memorial to God. Right in the middle of the river. They're covered. They're gone. We can't see them. But I'll guarantee you they're still there. Oh, they might be little pebbles by now with all the water washing across them, but they're still there. Why? Because God ordained it. God ordained it. He did what God said. He didn't go find stones. He didn't cut little notches in them so they'd sit and fit perfectly together. And he did what God said. He stacked them. He made them the way God said, and he left them as a memorial, building stones. Altars to God. Altars are not necessarily just for offering sacrifice of burnt things. Altars are for offering sacrifices of worship, for offering sacrifices of what God calls us to, and for memorials. To place something to remember what God has done. Not to go back and worship the altar, but to remember. Okay? That cross hanging in our sanctuary is a memorial to remember. We don't ever go pray to it. If I ever say, hey, I want you to come here and pray to the cross, then you guys should leave immediately. Or at least pray for me that I'll get my head screwed straight again. You know? It's not about those things. It's about God's way, God's direction, and God's will. Getting that fear of God in us, that reverent understanding of who He is, that reverent respecting of who He is, so that we might not sin and we might do it His way. Doing it His way. Let me keep my commandments. So no, and then verse 26 says this, nor shall you go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness may not be exposed on it. Now, this is important because when God establishes that altar for sacrifice or something, He's not looking for you to come in to defile it. He's not looking for that nakedness that He's talking about is not throwing your clothes off and jumping on it as that, but to expose the innermost parts of the sin of man up on that altar. What it is for God to take what God wants and do what God wants to with it, not for man to defile it in such a way that it would become something that was designed by or ordained by man. It's not for you to do that. This is not the altar that is in the courtyard of the tabernacle. It's not for that big brazen altar that's out there in front. This is a completely different issue because He hasn't established that yet. Because I know some of you are thinking, well, He's got the altar at the tabernacle in the temple where they come to offer sacrifice. There are steps up to it, and it's all but this is different. Because He's talking about the individual. That altar comes under Levitical law. This altar is under the Mosaic law to the individuals, not the Levitical law to the priesthood to offer up sacrifice for the people. Don't confuse the altars, okay? These are the altars that He calls on men to make. You see that Abraham made altars, right? Isaac made altars. Jacob made altars. Never do you find them going down and fashioning them beautifully. And they just put stones together. They did it God's way because that's how God directed them. Well, God's saying it out loud here. You need to follow the example of your forefathers. And when I say this, do it this way. Don't go try to dress up the altar. Don't go try to... When we built those little wooden altars that are sitting in there in our sanctuary right now, we built those things back in the... probably in the very late 90s or right around, or 80s, right around 90-ish, somewhere in that neighborhood. They were built before we ever moved into the bigger sanctuary that we had in the other building. They were built when we were still in that back little area. Bob DeWeese and some of the guys, we all got together and we made those. And there was talk when we made those things about how fancy they should be. Because they're not fancy. They're very simple. And this particular kind of conversation came up about the altar to God. That the altar wasn't supposed to be so ornate that it took away from the action of the altar. The purpose of the altar. I don't want to come up and admire the altar. I want to come and use the altar for the altar's purpose. The altar's purpose was a place where I could come before God and I could give my sacrifice before God. I could give my offering, which was in this day and age is my heart, my soul, my life. So when I come there, I don't want to go, ooh, how pretty. Look at the little ornate. I want to come there and just focus on God. So we made it very simple. Now, we also, at the same time, we made a big pulpit thing and a big old deal that was up in the front of that. I don't know how many. I know Sharon saw that. I don't know how many more of you guys saw that particular thing. And actually, we took it over and put it in the new building, and it was there for a long time, the big altar or big pulpit thing that we had that kind of extended across the entire stage. That was all built at the same time. Now, that was much prettier. That had spindles, and it was all hand done and beautifully done, and cross on the front, and all of it was etched and carved. It was done really, really beautifully. Much more attractive than the altars. The altars were very plain, but it was on purpose. because the altar is not the focus. It's just a place to come to offer the sacrifice. The altar shouldn't take away from the action at the altar. The altar is not supposed to take, the beauty of that altar should not detour you or distract you from the purpose you came with. So keep that in mind. There's a reason that those little wooden altars are so plain and just kind of almost look a little out of place these days just because you don't see them very often anymore, but they're there for a purpose. They shouldn't distract you or take your attention away. They should just be a place you could come. A place you can come. So I want us to see this out. I'm not going to jump into 21 today because we're going to get into 21 and 22. We're just going to get into a whole bunch of God laying out laws, and we'll talk about them as we go in those things. But I want us to understand these concepts very vividly, very deeply. The concept of coming before God the way God requires us to and not trying to dress it up for God. God didn't ask your opinion about how to come, and he didn't ask your design help. He didn't need any of that stuff. He just said, come, and here's how you do it. Right? Revere him, honor him enough just to listen to what he says and do it. That's awfully important, church. It's awfully important. I cannot overemphasize just doing it God's way enough. There's just no way. Because if we don't get that in our heads and our hearts, and we keep putting our own spin, so to speak, on the things God wants from us, we're not ever going to be successful. We're not ever going to be happy and full of God's joy. Because we're always trying to help him out. Has anybody in here ever tried to help God out? Yes. She said, I have suggestions. How does God handle those suggestions? He ignored it. Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I have occasion to help people with things sometimes. And one of the things that always just cracks me up is someone will come to me for help with something they don't know or understand. Ask, and sometimes even pay me for that help in a particular area, whether it's my theological knowledge or something spiritual, or it's my construction knowledge or something of that nature, whatever it is, come to me, want that help, and then once I give the help, want to argue the help. Well, how dare you think that just because you said it, it's okay? How dare you come to me and ask then? You come to me because you believe something that I may be knowledgeable about a subject, or maybe even an authority on a subject. I don't know. Whatever the purpose is you came to me for. And then all of a sudden you want to question it and say, well, no, I don't. Well, then don't come to me. Go somewhere else. You know? It's amazing. It's amazing. And I think God feels that way a lot. You come to me, I'm the creator of the universe. Now, of course, this is not because I have a God complex that I said that, okay? Don't take that the wrong way. It just cracks me up. But God, being God, has people come to him all the time. God help me, God save me, God this and that. And then God provides it, and God says, well, here you go. And then all of a sudden well, God, if you would just this, if you would do it this way, or yeah, I can't quite, then why'd you come to me in the first place? Right? There's a famous scene in that movie with Jack Nicholson, and they're talking about the way he defends the country and all that kind of stuff. And he's talking about, I'm willing to go and I'm willing to do this, this, and this, and all that stuff, and I'm willing to protect you. I do all this so you can sleep at night, and then you want to come along and question my motives on how I do it. I'd rather you just said thank you and moved along. Right? What's that movie? I don't remember what it's called. Him and Tom Cruise. A Few Good Men, yeah. And he says all that stuff. He says, I'd rather you just said thank you and you moved along, I know God has to feel that way an awful lot. I protect you. I save you. I do all that. And I would rather you just came in and said thank you than questioning me or trying to help me or offer your suggestions to me and all this other stuff. And it's so much different for us because here we are, the creation, and we're questioning the Creator. Questioning the ultimate authority in the universe. On how He does things. Or why He does things. Now, I told you last night it's okay to ask questions as long as you do it in the right way. Reverently, respectfully, before God. You have to be able to ask questions. But when God gives us answers or God directs us and then we just continue to go down our own roads, that's not asking questions. That's being a rebellious child. And that doesn't work. It never works. So you want to build an altar for God? Ask God what kind of altar He wants. And then do it His way. Built like a heart? Yeah. Well, I mean, if any way you look at this, whatever terminology you put on it, if you're going to come to God, you can't just say, well, I'm doing it for God or I'm doing it unto God. You can't do that unless it's what God has desired or what God has directed you to do. Because anything that you do outside of the direction or the will of God is no longer what you're doing for God. It's what you're doing for you to God. There's a big difference between doing something for God or doing something that you want to do for you to God. You ever give somebody a gift that you thought was absolutely fantastic and they hated it? I have gone and gotten my wife jewelry, spent lots of money to have my wife open it and go, oh, that's nice. Then take it back. Oh, no, it's nice. And then it just sits there and never gets worn. Right? You know why? Because I didn't research enough. I didn't find out what she really wanted. Shirley says, my husband did have a perfume. So he asked the sales lady what she liked, and that's what you got. Okay. And you weren't happy. Shirley, you and I need to talk about holding grudges. She said he never did it again. Yes.
I have a confession. I gave the credit card, so you get your own.
Dr. Master says he would just hand her the credit card and say, go get your own gift. None of us husbands appreciate you saying that out loud, by the way. I have learned. I've stopped buying my wife clothes. The only time I buy her jewelry now is if I'm absolutely certain that she's going to like it. And I make sure and get a gift receipt, and I stay on top of it, that if she doesn't like it, we take it back, right? We just did that. I got her something for Christmas. I thought it was really cool. It was this little Disney ring. It was a Maleficent ring. Well, no, I didn't mean anything by the Maleficent thing, right? You see the new movies, Maleficent kind of turns a little good, so I didn't mean anything. Maleficent is one of the Disney villain queens, but it was this really cool black kind of ring. It was really neat. But it was Maleficent. She's Cinderella. She really didn't want Maleficent, so we had to take that back. So if it's not what God wants, it's useless, right? It may have been costly to you. You may have invested time and blood, sweat, and tears and all kinds of stuff in it, only to give it and it be rejected. You might be a little bit of Cain. You might go find the best you've got and put it all together and arrange it beautifully and say, God, here it is. And God's saying, that's not what I asked for. But God, it's the best I've got. God said, it's not what I asked for. Can we submit to the will of God? Can we stop giving God what we think is good enough, or what we think he wants, or what we think is best, and start seeking God, seeking his will, and obeying it? That's what he's directing Israel to do. I don't want what you think is best. I want what I've called you to. Because what I've called you to is going to elevate you to places you had no idea you could achieve. It will let you do things you didn't think you could ever do. Look, I've been, in the last several years, I have been places I never thought I would go. I really have. I really never expected to be this traveling kind of missionary guy in places across the world. Never really expected that. Really didn't want that. If I'd been traveling around the country singing and playing, that's one thing. But kind of going around the world was never in my vision. I'm doing things now with organizations not only did I not ever think I would do, I never wanted to do. Not sure I want to now, but I want to seek the will of God. I've decided that the will of God was more important than what I want. And in that process, I'm seeing things, and I'm seeing people in my life, and I'm seeing kind of respects being given to me that I never would have expected. I really wouldn't, and I still don't understand them. I don't get it. I don't know why any of them would come to me. But God takes us, when we obey his will, to places we don't get, we don't understand. Why? Because he has the blueprint. It's the one thing as a contractor I really get upset with God about. God, if you'll share the blueprint with me, I know how to read them. Just share it with me. And I believe God's probably laughing at me every time I get down on that bent, because he's going, you might read your blueprints, but you don't understand anything I got to say. The only thing you need to understand is do and don't. And when you'll honor that and get to the will of God, he'll take care of you. Right? He'll do it. Anybody with any questions before we dismiss? Sorry to all the Facebook people. If you guys are watching and you had questions today and they didn't get answered, my normal moderator weren't here and I just didn't hook it up today. So I'll try to look at the Facebook and see if there were any questions. If there were, I'll try to answer you privately. We'll be dismissed today. Thank you for being here, and we will see you all. Well, ladies meeting tomorrow night, 7 o'clock, and then back here on Sunday, 10 o'clock, ready to worship the Lord. All right? Heavenly Father, we once again thank you so much for your love and grace and mercy in our lives, and we thank you for this wonderful opportunity to study your word. I pray today, God, that you continue to help us kill our own will. Help us just put it aside and crucify it so that we might obey your will. Continue to give us the strength and the courage to do so. It's one of the things we lack the most, is just the courage to obey you and to believe what you say without thought, without trying to decipher it, trying to figure it out. God, just let us believe it. Let us have the courage to do that. And we pray that we do that in all areas of our life. Today, bless us, keep us, bring us back the next appointed time. In your name we pray. Amen.